The cold, metallic echo of two gunshots shattered the silence of the camper. Emily Jean Ferlazzo lay motionless on the bed, her life violently snuffed out by the one man who should have protected her, her husband. In the eerie stillness that followed, Joseph Ferrazzo's hands, now stained with blood, didn't tremble with regret. Instead, he acted with chilling calm, dragging her lifeless body into the bathroom, his mind already calculating the next steps to cover his crime. What led this man to murder the woman he once vowed to love? Welcome to The Last Verdict. In today's case, we are going to delve into the chilling murder of Emily Jean Ferlazzo, a 22-year-old woman whose life was tragically taken by her own husband, Joseph Ferlazzo. We'll explore the disturbing details of the crime, the investigation that followed, and the emotional toll on Emily's family as they search for answers. So stay with us, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to this channel. Now let's get into it. Case 1. David Adam Pate. Ricky James, a 33-year-old man from Lancaster, South Carolina, was a quiet, reserved individual with a troubled past. He had recently met David Adam Pate, a 25-year-old with a history of violence and affiliations with white supremacist groups. The two had spent the day drinking together, unaware of the horrific turn their meeting would take. Ricky had no idea that he was about to become the victim of an unprovoked and brutal attack. The crime took place in a wooded area near Pate's home. After spending some time drinking, David lured Ricky deeper into the woods under the pretense of further interaction. Without warning, Pate attacked Ricky with a butcher knife, stabbing him 39 times in a brutal, almost ritualistic fashion. Pate later confessed that the knife reminded him of the one used by the iconic killer, Michael Myers, from the Halloween movies.
Ever seen Michael Myers? Yeah.
The scene was gruesome. Ricky's body was left in the brush, concealed but not thoroughly, and only discovered weeks later by children playing in the woods. The case was chilling not only because of the sheer violence, but the coldness with which it was carried out. David Adam Pate was a 25-year-old man with a history of violent behavior and prior convictions, including burglary. Known for his affiliation with white supremacist ideologies, Pate had tattoos reflecting his extremist beliefs, including one that said Satan across his face. His criminal history, paired with a reputation for violence, painted a dark picture of a man capable of extreme actions. Pate was released from prison not long before the murder and exhibited behaviors that were concerning to those around him, including his affiliation with violent gangs and his disturbing personality traits. On the fateful day of the murder, Pate lured Ricky James into the woods under the guise of spending time together. They shared wine, and after some time without any real provocation, Pate pulled out a butcher knife and stabbed Ricky 39 times. The attack was quick but brutal, with Pate later claiming that he enjoyed the memory of the killing. Afterward, he attempted to conceal the body by dragging it with rope toward a creek, though he was too drunk to finish the task. He left Ricky's body under a pile of brush, returning the next day to cover it further. The crime scene was hauntingly careless, showing no remorse from Pate, even as he made little effort to hide the body properly. Pate's confession indicated a deep lack of remorse or emotional disturbance. He described the murder as something he simply wanted to do, with no real emotional or rational explanation, except a vague sense of enjoyment.
I'm going back with all that. He goes, you're right. He get up and you stick in a second thing. He's right there. Yeah, forward, I put it in. And say that these guilty things all over me. And all of them playing around with his
His motive seemed tied to a combination of personal violence, gang affiliations, and perhaps the thrill of acting on his darker impulses. His calm demeanor after the crime and his later confession painted a picture of a man who was both aware and indifferent to the gravity of his actions. he seemed more preoccupied with explaining the murder away, even blaming the victim for going into the woods with someone like him. It wasn't until approximately a month later that Ricky James's body was discovered by children playing in the woods. They stumbled upon the decomposed body, which had been concealed under some brush. The discovery prompted an investigation, and it didn't take long for law enforcement to piece together the facts. DNA evidence from the crime scene and the victim's family pointing out Pate's bloody appearance immediately after the crime were key to identifying him as a suspect. Investigators quickly connected Pate to the murder. Multiple knives, both commercially made and homemade, were found at his residence, along with more than 20 face masks. This bizarre evidence suggested a deeply troubled and violent personality. His family members informed the authorities that he had been covered in blood right after the murder and had tried to burn his clothes. When questioned, Pate confessed to the crime, though he blamed the victim, claiming it was somehow Ricky's fault for being in the woods with him. Pate was arrested for the crime while already in custody for an unrelated charge of disorderly conduct. During police interrogation, he gave a detailed confession, showing no remorse for his actions. His confession included chilling details, as he seemed to revel in the memory of the brutal attack. Pate's matter-of-fact demeanor and his willingness to discuss the crime with investigators suggested a deeply disturbed individual who viewed the murder as an almost casual event. During the trial, Pate's defense team acknowledged his confession, but argued for consideration of his past and his apparent acceptance of responsibility. However, the prosecution focused on the brutality of the murder and the cold, remorseless manner in which Pate carried out the attack. They emphasized his long criminal history, his lack of emotional reaction, and his white supremacist affiliations, making him a threat to society. Ricky James's family provided emotional victim impact statements, expressing their sorrow over the brutal loss. They spoke of the man Ricky was, a person who did not deserve such a violent and senseless end.
As the solicitor gave me a review of what was going on in the case, he said, I killed him because he came to the woods with me. And why would somebody want to talk to me look like this? But my brother was the type of person who had no strangers with nobody. Like, everybody was treated fairly with him. His only weakness was that he drunk, and when he started to drink, he started to trust people too much.
The impact of his death on his family was profound, as they struggled with the brutality of the crime and the apparent indifference of the perpetrator. Pate was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge described the crime as senseless, noting the lack of any reasonable explanation for the murder. The sentence was met with tears from the victim's family and applause from others in the courtroom. Pate's cold and emotionless behavior throughout the trial and his brutal actions left no doubt that he would remain a danger to society. The emotional toll on Ricky's family and the community was immense. The brutal and senseless nature of the crime left a lasting scar as they grappled with the randomness and violence of the murder. Ricky's family continues to mourn, knowing that the perpetrator will never be free again, but also struggling with the fact that his life was so violently taken from him. As of 25, David Adam Pate remains incarcerated, having served 11 years of his life sentence. His case, though it has faded from the public eye, continues to serve as a chilling reminder of the depths of human violence. No appeals have been successful, and Pate will remain behind bars for the rest of his life. Case 2. Joshua Amburgy. Melissa, 58 years old, was a mother who had spent years trying to get mental health care and support for her son, Joshua. She had lived through many challenges, including her own struggles with mental health and her unyielding support for Joshua despite his violent tendencies. Melissa had long been known for her nurturing character, and she had recently been separated from her husband. Joshua Amburgy's 10-year-old son, the child was living in the home with his mother, and he tragically witnessed the events that transpired, though he was not physically harmed. His psychological trauma from the incident would affect him for years to come. Crime scene. On the afternoon of November 1st, 2022, Joshua Amburgy brutally stabbed his mother, Melissa, 7 times in a violent attack in their home in Miami Township, Ohio. The attack occurred shortly after Joshua had requested that his mother come upstairs, which she declined. After descending into the basement, Joshua carried out the fatal assault with a kitchen knife. His father, Ted, tried to intervene, but he was unsuccessful. The scene was grim. Melissa was gravely injured and airlifted to the hospital, where she later died from her wounds. Joshua fled the scene, but officers quickly apprehended him. Joshua Amburgy. Joshua, 40 years old, had a history of mental health challenges and a violent criminal past. His relationship with his mother was troubled, though he had shown some positive intentions in his younger years. However, he had recently shown signs of anger and aggression, particularly after his mother had intervened in his life. He was living with his parents due to these mental health challenges and was a suspect in prior violent incidents. His violent tendencies had been building up for months, and he had previously been in trouble with the law for assaulting a police officer. The crime occurred after Joshua's mother, Melissa, declined his request to come upstairs. He then descended into the basement and stabbed her multiple times. When Joshua's father, Ted, tried to intervene, Joshua continued his attack. Joshua then fled the scene with the knife and was found shortly thereafter by police. Joshua confessed to the murder but expressed no remorse, stating that he had acted in the heat of the moment. Joshua's attack on his mother appeared to stem from a deep frustration and anger toward her. It seemed that his inability to cope with life's challenges, coupled with untreated mental health issues, led to the violent outbursts. Joshua later stated in court that he had felt his mother's involvement in his life was overwhelming, and his rage toward her had built up over time. Joshua's violent actions were quickly reported when his father, Ted, found him standing over his mother's gravely injured body and attempted to intervene. Emergency responders were called to the scene and Melissa was airlifted to the hospital, but succumbed to her injuries. After the crime, Joshua fled the house with the murder weapon, which raised concerns. Law enforcement quickly tracked him down, and his violent history and the nature of the crime led them to apprehend him without further incident. The police were able to quickly connect Joshua to the crime scene, as evidence, including the murder weapon, was recovered. Joshua's confession confirmed the horrific details of the attack. Investigators found that Joshua had planned the crime and had been harboring anger toward his mother for some time. Further analysis of his behavior, as well as a history of violent tendencies, gave insight into his psychological state leading up to the crime. Joshua was arrested at a nearby residence shortly after the crime. He did not resist and admitted to the stabbing. His lack of remorse during his confession further complicated the case and made his mental state a critical focus of the legal proceedings. Joshua's confession, as well as his behavior following the crime, painted a picture of a man struggling with his emotions and who had acted out of frustration. He expressed no empathy for his actions, which would later impact the trial. During the trial, Joshua's defense team argued that his violent actions were heavily influenced by his mental health struggles. However, the prosecution highlighted the methodical nature of the crime and the lack of any signs of self-defense. Joshua's attorneys attempted to argue that his mental illness played a key role in the crime, and they called for leniency, suggesting that he should be given the chance to rehabilitate in a mental health facility. The prosecution focused on the brutal nature of the crime and the lack of any self-defense by Melissa. They emphasized the premeditated nature of the attack. Family members and close friends of Melissa expressed their heartbreak during the trial, emphasizing the pain of losing a mother and a loved one in such a brutal and senseless manner. The emotional toll on the surviving family, particularly Joshua's young son, was made clear in victim statements. The boy's testimony was emotionally charged, highlighting the trauma he experienced from witnessing the murder and living in fear for weeks after. Joshua Amburgy was sentenced to 41 years to life in prison for the murder of his mother, Melissa. The judge emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime and the emotional and psychological toll on the surviving family. The courtroom was tense and Joshua showed no visible remorse, maintaining that his actions were not premeditated. The impact of the crime was felt deeply by the community, especially those who knew Melissa and saw her as a loving, caring mother. The loss of Melissa was felt deeply within the family, especially by her son who had witnessed the attack. The community was shocked by the senselessness of the crime, and Joshua's apparent lack of remorse only added to the grief. Melissa's relatives expressed outrage and sadness at the loss, and her son would need years of emotional support to cope with the trauma. As of 2025, Joshua remains incarcerated at the Claremont County Jail, where he is serving his sentence. His future remains uncertain, but it is likely he will spend decades in prison before any chance of parole, which would only be available after he serves 41 years. Joshua has not made any public attempts to appeal his sentence or request parole. His future in prison seems bleak, and he is expected to remain behind bars for the rest of his life. Case 3. Adrian Oswaldo Sura Reyes. The chaos was terrifying, unfolding within minutes. A crowd of innocent bystanders gathered outside a local bar screamed in horror as a car barreled toward them, running them over with shocking speed. The sound of metal crunching and screams filled the air, but this was just the beginning of the terror Adrian Reyes would cause. The rampage continued at a second scene, where the suspect brutally attacked his own mother with a hammer, leaving a trail of blood and destruction that would forever scar his family and the community. Rebecca L. Reese, 50 years old, a beloved member of the local community who was enjoying a fundraiser for families affected by a tragic house fire. Rebecca's kindness and involvement with the event stood in stark contrast to the violent end she would meet. Rosa Reyes, 56 years old, Adrian's mother who had lived a quiet life and worked tirelessly to support her son. The crime, rooted in frustration and family conflict, culminated in her tragic death in her own home. The first crime scene was chaos. At approximately 6:15 p.m. in front of the Barrack Bar, Adrian drove his vehicle directly into a group of 75 people gathered for a fundraising event. One victim, Rebecca, was instantly killed, and many others were critically injured. Eyewitnesses could only watch in disbelief as the vehicle sped away. The second scene occurred just moments later at Adrian's home, where after hitting his mother with his car, he proceeded to brutally strike her multiple times with a hammer. The gruesome scene left Rosa lifeless on the floor, with blood splattered across the room. There was no sign of struggle, only the deliberate actions of a man consumed by rage. Adrian Reyes, 24, had lived with his mother for most of his life. Known for his volatile emotions, he had a history of violent outbursts, often connected to financial and personal frustrations. His inability to cope with stress and his escalating aggression towards his mother were evident. For the murders, Adrian had been involved in multiple incidents of violence within the family, and his mental state had become increasingly fragile in the months leading to the crimes. Adrian's violent actions began with a targeted attack on the crowd outside the bar in Barrack, where he deliberately swerved into them in a shocking and senseless act. His explanation? "I just ran them over." After this, he returned home, where he confronted his mother. Following their earlier argument, he deliberately hit her with his vehicle before retrieving a hammer and bludgeoning her multiple times. The crime scenes were connected by the violence and methodical approach, revealing Adrian's intent to leave a trail of destruction behind him. His confession provided chilling details about his emotional exhaustion and frustration, though he claimed not to have fully realized the consequences of his actions. Adrian's emotional state appeared to be a major driving factor in the crimes. He spoke about feeling overwhelmed by the stress of his relationship with his mother and his financial struggles. He felt trapped and was emotionally exhausted from constant tension, particularly regarding his mother's involvement in his life. His confession hinted at deep anger and a complete breakdown of control in the heat of the moment. His emotional instability was reflected in his behavior, as he later described the attacks as a means to end it all, overwhelmed by the sense of being stuck. The crime was quickly discovered when police responded to a 911 call from a bystander who had witnessed the vehicular attack. Within minutes, law enforcement converged on both crime scenes. Investigators linked the two incidents together when they realized both involved Adrian Reyes. His mother's murder was discovered shortly after the crash, with forensic evidence and witness statements confirming his involvement. Authorities quickly traced Adrian's movements and found his vehicle at the scene of the first crime. Forensic evidence tied him directly to both attacks. Witnesses and security footage confirmed his actions. Reyes was located not long after the crimes at a convenience store where he was apprehended without incident. The evidence gathered, his vehicle, surveillance footage, and his confession sealed his fate. Adrian was arrested at a local convenience store after an officer recognized him. He was taken to the station where he confessed to both murders in great detail. He explained his frustration, stating that he just wanted to be done with it, referring to his tumultuous relationship with his mother. Despite claiming to have acted out of fear and exhaustion, his confession showed little remorse for his actions. The trial saw Adrian pleading guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. His defense focused on his emotional state, citing mental health struggles and the extreme stress he had been under. Despite these arguments, the prosecution emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime and the violent method of execution. During sentencing, Rebecca's family spoke about the devastation her death had caused. She was kind-hearted, and now she's gone, taken away in an instant, a senseless tragedy that could have been avoided. Rosa's family expressed deep pain at the loss of their mother, and the impact on Adrian's siblings was profound. The emotional toll on both victims' families was undeniable. The public's horror at the random nature of the vehicular attack on an innocent crowd only intensified the grief. Adrian Reyes was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders of his mother and Rebecca. The court also imposed additional sentences for attempted murder charges related to the 17 people he injured in the vehicle attack. In a statement, the judge described his actions as deliberate, heartless, and without remorse. Rosa's family continues to mourn the loss of a mother who had been a pillar in their lives. The random violence not only devastated her loved ones, but also shattered the sense of safety in their community. The death of Rebecca left her family in shock, as she had been an active and beloved member of their community. Both families are left with emotional scars that will never heal. Adrian Reyes remains incarcerated, serving his life sentences. His appeal for a reduction in his sentence was denied. His emotional state during the trial and his lack of remorse continue to haunt those who knew him and the families affected by his actions. He remains at Columbia County Correctional Facility, serving his life sentence. Case 4, Muhammad Altantawi. Nada Huran, a 35-year-old mother of 3, was a personal trainer at the Franklin Athletic Club and the backbone of her family. Recently separated from her husband, Dr. Basil Altantawi, Nada had been working to redefine her life. She had started to embrace a more independent existence, shedding old traditions and beliefs, and was preparing for a new chapter. That morning, she had no idea her life would be violently cut short by the very son she had nurtured and loved. The scene at the family home in Farmington Hills was horrifying. Nada was found lying motionless on the patio of their upscale mansion. It initially appeared as if she had fallen from the second-floor window. However, closer inspection revealed the true nature of the crime. Evidence of asphyxiation was found, and it became clear that this was no accident. Surveillance footage from the property revealed troubling shadows of someone lifting a heavy object toward the window before a body fell. Muhammad Altantawi, her 16-year-old son, was the only male in the house that morning. His presence at the crime scene became the first clue for investigators. Muhammad Altantawi, a 16-year-old high school student, had always been quiet and reserved. He was the eldest of 3 children, and his strained relationship with his mother had been escalating in recent months. As his parents' divorce became more contentious, Muhammad became increasingly resentful of his mother's newfound independence. Friends and family had noted a significant shift in his behavior, with some mentioning that his relationship with his mother had become more strained after she adopted a more modern lifestyle. On the morning of August 21, 2017, Muhammad and his mother had a brief interaction before he decided to carry out his horrifying plan. At first, he denied being in the room when Nada fell, but as the investigation unfolded, his version of events kept changing. He later confessed that he had smothered his mother, potentially with a pillow or cloth, before staging the scene to look like an accidental fall. Surveillance footage contradicted his story, revealing shadows near the window and showing Muhammad in the area just before the fall. Muhammad's motivation seemed to stem from a combination of anger and resentment toward his mother for the breakdown of the family unit. He had blamed her for the collapse of his home life and felt rejected by her desire to move on from their traditional lifestyle. Psychological evaluations suggested Muhammad's emotional turmoil was exacerbated by the ongoing divorce and the cultural shift his mother was embracing. His actions, cold and methodical, suggested a deep inner conflict that manifested violently. The crime went undiscovered until Nada's 14-year-old daughter, Aya, noticed her mother's absence. After searching the home and not finding Nada, Aya discovered her mother's lifeless body in the backyard. Initial signs indicated a fall, but suspicion quickly turned to Muhammad as investigators reviewed the footage and discovered discrepancies in his statements. Investigators quickly reviewed the property's surveillance footage and found evidence that Muhammad had been in the area just moments before the fall. His shifting story and the lack of any credible explanation raised suspicions. As the police zeroed in on Muhammad, they uncovered further evidence of his strained relationship with his mother. This evidence led to his arrest, and during questioning, he confessed to smothering his mother, admitting his anger had boiled over during an argument. Muhammad was arrested shortly after the confession. His demeanor during his arrest was cold, and he showed no significant emotional reaction. During his confession, he claimed he had done it in the heat of the moment, a claim that was challenged by the evidence showing a premeditated aspect to his actions. The trial of Muhammad Altantawi revolved around whether his actions were premeditated or the result of a fleeting moment of rage. His defense argued that his actions had been impulsive, driven by emotional distress over his mother's divorce and her lifestyle changes. The prosecution, however, pointed to the calculated nature of the crime, using the surveillance footage and Muhammad's inconsistent statements as evidence of premeditation. Nada's family was devastated by her death. Her younger children were left without a mother, and her ex-husband expressed his heartbreak at the loss. Aya, Nada's daughter, delivered an emotional statement, recounting her shock and pain at losing her mother at the hands of her brother. The family highlighted the psychological trauma they would carry for the rest of their lives, trying to reconcile the memory of the mother they loved with the horrifying act of violence she endured. Muhammad Altantawi was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 40 years in prison. He showed minimal reaction during sentencing, and his apology to the court was seen as empty. The judge remarked on the brutality of the crime, particularly the emotional devastation it caused to the surviving family members. Muhammad's age played a role in his sentencing, but the nature of the crime overshadowed his youth, resulting in a long prison term. Nada's family continues to struggle with the aftermath of her death. The murder, especially perpetrated by her own son, left them emotionally shattered. The trauma of witnessing their mother's death, knowing it was at the hands of a family member, is something that will affect them for the rest of their lives. As of 2025, Muhammad remains incarcerated, having served several years of his sentence. His case sparked discussions about the pressures faced by children in divorced households, the effects of emotional distress, and the potential for violence when mental health issues go unaddressed. Muhammad's family, though devastated, is now focused on healing, while Muhammad's future remains uncertain as he faces years of incarceration ahead. Case 5. Timothy Ray Jones Jr. Timothy Ray Jones Jr.'s 5 children were just starting their young lives, with each child holding unique dreams and aspirations. At the time of the crime, 8-year-old Mira, 7-year-old Elias, 6-year-old Nathan, 2-year-old Gabriel, and 1-year-old Abigail were in the care of their father, who had full custody following a contentious divorce. Despite the loving nature of the children, there was an undercurrent of fear surrounding their father. The children's mother, Amber Kaiser, had fought a losing battle in court to regain custody, and it seemed that Jones was growing increasingly rigid and abusive in his dealings with them. On the day of the murder, the children were simply going about their normal routines, unaware that their lives were about to be cut tragically short. The scene was unimaginable. The children were each methodically executed by their father, who lured them into a position where they could not escape. Nathan, the 6-year-old, was made to endure an ordeal of physical exercise that led to his death. His siblings were not spared. The youngest, 1-year-old Abigail, and 2-year-old Gabriel were beaten with a belt, their young bodies no match for the vicious force of their father. Mira and Elias, the older children, had begged for their lives, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. Their bodies were found separately, each one exhibiting the horrific signs of a violent and senseless attack. There was no escape for them as Jones brutally took their lives one by one. The children's bodies were placed in plastic bags, a cruel and callous method of hiding the bodies. Timothy Ray Jones Jr. was 32 years old at the time of the crime. A former software engineer, Jones had a history of emotional instability and erratic behavior. Raised with a strict religious upbringing, he became increasingly authoritarian and controlling over the years. Prior to the incident, Jones had shown signs of increasing emotional detachment, and his behavior had worsened in the months leading up to the murders. He had a history of violent outbursts, though he had never been charged with a crime of this magnitude. His obsession with control and his view of his children as tools of his own emotional manipulation likely played a role in the senseless deaths of his innocent family. Jones's crime was methodical and brutal. After discovering that his son Nathan had broken an electrical outlet, Jones became enraged. He began punishing his son with grueling physical exercises that lasted for hours, eventually leading to Nathan's death. Instead of seeking help, he turned on the remaining children. Mira and Elias, despite their attempts to escape, were ruthlessly killed. Gabriel and Abigail, the 2 youngest, were not spared either, with Jones using a belt to strike them. Jones placed each of the bodies in black trash bags as if they were just discarded items. He spent the next several days driving across the South, making stops at convenience stores, while his children's remains decomposed in the back of his SUV. His actions were cold and calculated, as he meticulously tried to cover up his heinous crime. Jones was a man consumed by his need for control. His confession revealed that the murders were partly driven by a desire to punish his children for what he saw as their disobedience. His loss of control, triggered by the trivial issue of a broken outlet, spiraled into an irreversible tragedy. In his mind, by killing his children, he was somehow reclaiming control over his life. His cold, emotionless confession hinted at a deep psychological break, as he admitted that he thought he was doing the right thing. The death of his children, as much as it was about his rage, seemed to stem from an inability to process his own emotional and psychological burdens. In his twisted logic, he believed he was helping them by ending their lives. The crime might have gone unnoticed for much longer had it not been for a routine traffic checkpoint. On September 6, 2014, Jones was arrested during a routine stop in Mississippi. Officers noted a strong, foul smell emanating from his vehicle. Upon searching the SUV, they discovered the bodies of his 5 children, decomposed and wrapped in plastic. The evidence was overwhelming, and the investigation quickly turned toward Jones. Despite his initial attempt to explain away the situation, his behavior, including his strange detachment, led investigators to dig deeper into the crime. Law enforcement quickly pieced together the events. They traced Jones's whereabouts over the course of several days, uncovering surveillance footage and electronic data that placed him in various locations, all while the children's bodies remained in the back of his vehicle. Interviews with neighbors and relatives shed light on Jones's deteriorating mental state in the months leading up to the murders. His erratic behavior, the strained relationship with his ex-wife, and his obsessive need for control all pointed to a man on the brink. The chilling confession he gave to investigators confirmed the prosecution's suspicions and provided a grim look into his mind during the murder spree. Jones was arrested without resistance. In his confession, he admitted to killing his children, though he claimed that his actions were an overreaction to a small mistake. He expressed no remorse for his actions, explaining them in a cold, detached manner. The lack of emotion during his confession only added to the horror of the crime. Despite the brutal nature of the murders, Jones seemed to justify them as the natural consequence of his desire to correct his children's behavior. His confession was chilling, revealing a man who had rationalized his crime and seemed to carry no remorse for the devastating consequences. The trial of Timothy Ray Jones Jr. was marked by a series of emotional testimonies and legal arguments. His defense team argued that Jones had suffered from significant mental health issues, including a history of trauma and psychological breakdowns. They pointed to his inability to process stress and emotional strain as a mitigating factor. However, the prosecution argued that Jones's actions were deliberate and premeditated, with no signs of emotional instability during the killings. The gruesome details of the crime, including the bodies of the children found in black trash bags, were presented in court, solidifying Jones's guilt. The family of the victims was deeply affected by the tragedy. During the sentencing phase, relatives of the murdered children spoke out. One relative stated, "Those kids didn't deserve to die like that. They were innocent. They deserved to grow up, to experience life. Instead, they were taken from us in the worst way imaginable." The statements from loved ones were poignant and heartbreaking, underscoring the loss not only for the immediate family, but for the community at large. On June 13, 2018, Jones was sentenced to death for the brutal murders of his 5 children. The jury had found him guilty on all counts of first-degree murder. The judge described the crime as one of the most horrific cases he had ever seen and emphasized that Jones's actions were cold, calculated, and devoid of any remorse. The death penalty was imposed, and Jones's name was added to South Carolina's death row. His actions left an indelible mark on his family, friends, and the community, as they struggled to come to terms with the incomprehensible violence he inflicted on his own children. The emotional toll of the crime has been felt by Jones's surviving family members, the community, and law enforcement officers who worked on the case. The children's mother, Amber Kaiser, has struggled with feelings of guilt, though she had no control over the situation. The grief has been compounded by the fact that the children were taken in such a brutal and senseless manner. "They never had a chance," one family member stated during a memorial service. The entire community was left reeling from the loss, as the murder of 5 young lives seemed almost too painful to comprehend. As of 2025, Timothy Ray Jones Jr. remains incarcerated on death row at the Kirkland Correctional Institution. Despite numerous appeals, the death sentence has been upheld, and he continues to serve his sentence. The case remains a somber reminder of the fragility of life, especially when the violence comes from someone who was meant to protect. Jones's psychological state, his inability to control his emotions, and his deep-seated rage at his children's perceived transgressions continue to haunt the case. There are no indications that Jones will be released, and he will likely spend the rest of his life in prison with his death sentence still pending execution. Case 6, Joseph Czuba. Susan Ramberg was a 37-year-old mother, known for her warmth and strong sense of responsibility. She had been living with her 10-year-old son, Wade Alfaumi, and had recently begun renting rooms in her home. By all accounts, she had a friendly relationship with her landlord, Joseph Czuba. Despite the outwardly peaceful living arrangement, tensions were brewing as the emotional and psychological toll of the Israel-Hamas conflict began affecting Joseph. The scene was chilling and grim. Police arrived at the home after a welfare check led to the discovery of Susan's decomposed body hidden in the trunk of her vehicle in the garage. The child, Wade, had been subjected to unimaginable violence. His lifeless body was found nearby, covered in a blood-stained blanket. The house, once a home filled with life, was now a site of terror. The tragic details would soon unfold, but not before the community was left in shock by the brutal assault that would forever alter their lives. Joseph Czuba, 71 years old at the time of the crime, was a quiet, unassuming man with a history of mental health struggles. He had previously shown signs of paranoia, especially after the outbreak of the Israel-Hamas conflict, which seemed to trigger an irrational fear of his tenants. Despite outwardly appearing friendly, Joseph had a dark side, one that would ultimately emerge in a horrific act of violence. On the morning of October 14, 2023, Joseph Czuba entered the room where Susan was staying, physically assaulted her, and choked her to death. Wade, Susan's young son, was next. Joseph violently attacked him, stabbing him over 26 times in a brutal and senseless act of rage. Following the killings, Joseph attempted to cover his tracks, hiding Susan's body in the vehicle's trunk. While the young boy was left to suffer in isolation in the home for weeks, living in the terrifying presence of his mother's corpse. Joseph's emotions appeared to be deeply clouded by paranoia. He had become increasingly convinced that his tenants, Susan and Wade, posed a threat due to their ethnicity and religion. His deepening delusions about an imminent threat ultimately led him to commit the unthinkable. The confession he later provided was chilling, revealing that he felt justified in his actions. Justified, he claimed, by the terror he believed was about to come. The crime came to light when Susan's son, Wade, managed to escape and alert authorities to the horrors unfolding within the home. When police arrived, they found Susan's decomposing body hidden in the trunk, while Wade's body was discovered in another part of the house. His presence in the home while the murders occurred added an unimaginable layer of trauma to the case. Law enforcement quickly pieced together the disturbing details, including text messages from Susan's phone and the child's testimony. Evidence revealed that Joseph had been increasingly paranoid, fearing that his tenants might bring harm to him due to their ethnicity. Police also uncovered Joseph's confession, revealing his fear-driven motivation. The evidence was overwhelming, and the community was left in shock at the brutality of the crime. Joseph Czuba was arrested after his confession to his parents, who alerted the police. He did not resist arrest and seemed to show no remorse for his actions. His confession during questioning was chilling. He expressed no guilt for what he had done, instead rationalizing his actions as a necessary act of self-preservation. Joseph's trial was a heartbreaking, intense affair. The defense presented his mental health issues as a mitigating factor, while the prosecution emphasized the brutality of the crime, especially considering the age of his victims. The case brought attention to the mental health crisis that can sometimes fuel violence, but it also left the community with a sense of sorrow and loss. Susan's family members took the stand, expressing their devastation at the loss of Susan and Wade. They spoke about the horrors of discovering the bodies and the lasting emotional toll on the surviving family members. Wade should have had his whole life ahead of him, and Susan was just starting to rebuild her life. This tragedy robbed them of everything, one relative said. Joseph Czuba was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge called the crime unfathomably horrific and emphasized the emotional trauma inflicted on the surviving family members. Joseph's lack of remorse and rationalization of his actions weighed heavily on the court's decision. The emotional toll on Susan's family was immeasurable. The child, Wade, had witnessed and endured unspeakable horror, and his family was left to grieve the senseless loss of his young life. The community, too, was shaken, struggling to understand how something so violent could happen in their midst. Joseph Czuba remains incarcerated at the Stateville Correctional Center, serving his life sentence. His trial and subsequent conviction brought some closure to the case, but the emotional scars on the family will never heal. As of March 2025, Joseph remains in prison, serving a sentence that ensures he will never have the chance to harm anyone again. Case 7, Curtis Michael Algier. Officer Stephen Anderson was a 60-year-old veteran with the Utah Department of Corrections, dedicated to his work, having served for 22 years. Known for his calm demeanor and professionalism, Anderson had a family and was respected in the prison community. He was tasked with escorting Curtis Michael Algier, a high-risk inmate, to a routine MRI appointment on June 25, 2007. On that fateful day, Anderson's job would be his last. He was assigned to accompany a man whose violent history would make this escort far from ordinary. The crime scene unfolded at the University of Utah Orthopedic Center. Anderson was there to monitor Algier as he received an MRI for a back issue. During the procedure, the protocol required Anderson to remove the metal handcuffs and replace them with plastic flex cuffs. In an instant, Algier seized the opportunity. As Anderson was distracted, he grabbed Anderson's own firearm, shooting him twice, once in the head, once in the chest, before fleeing the scene. The medical facility turned into a crime scene filled with chaos and horror as medical staff rushed to save Anderson's life. But it was too late. Officer Anderson had died on the floor of the MRI room, an innocent man murdered in cold blood. His body would later be found in a pool of his own blood. An officer who had dedicated his life to serving the community, taken without warning. Curtis Michael Algier, 27, had a long history of criminal activity that began in his teens. Known to law enforcement as a violent figure, he had been involved in numerous incidents, including theft, assault, and firearms-related crimes. His white supremacist tattoos and violent tendencies made him a significant threat to society. By 2007, he was already serving time in the Utah State Prison for possession of a firearm by a convicted felon and other offenses. Algier's release from prison earlier had not come without a history of violence and defiance against the authorities. The crime was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. Algier had carefully orchestrated his escape plan. After shooting Officer Anderson, Algier hijacked a civilian vehicle and initiated a high-speed pursuit, driving erratically through Utah streets. Despite his best efforts to escape, he eventually ran into a flat tire, forcing him to abandon the car. He fled on foot into a nearby Arby's restaurant, where he attacked an employee, pistol whipping them and later slashing another man's throat. The violence was relentless, but in the end, Algier's own violent tendencies would betray him. During his arrest, Algier displayed little remorse, even in his police interviews. When asked why he killed Officer Anderson, Algier stated, "I didn't want to get locked up again." In his mind, the murder was an unfortunate but necessary act to further his escape, an escape that had been years in the making. At the core of Algier's actions lay a deep-seated hatred for authority. His white supremacist beliefs and past violence led him down a destructive path, one that culminated in a calculated attempt to kill and escape. While he expressed little remorse for the murder itself, he later suggested that his actions were driven by a desire to avoid further incarceration. His violent history only continued to escalate after the shooting, with a series of attacks on innocent people in an attempt to flee. The investigation began swiftly after Officer Anderson's death. Surveillance footage from the medical center helped law enforcement trace Algiers' actions, and within minutes, they were able to confirm that he had fled the scene. The subsequent high-speed chase through Utah led authorities closer to him, until finally, his vehicle was disabled. Algiers' violent escape only added to the chaos as he attempted to evade capture at any cost. In the aftermath of the shooting, law enforcement immediately initiated a manhunt. A combination of traffic camera footage, witness statements, and forensics quickly pieced together the horrifying sequence of events. Authorities tracked Algiers' every move, throughout the state, in the stolen car, and finally, to the Arby's restaurant where he attempted to continue his escape by attacking another person. His violent behavior only sealed his fate. Within hours of the shooting, Algiers was apprehended and taken into custody. Algiers' arrest was relatively uneventful compared to the chaotic escape. He was found attempting to blend in at a convenience store, still in possession of the stolen car and weaponry. His confession to the crime came shortly after he was detained. He showed little remorse, stating that the shooting was a necessary step to avoid being locked away for life. His cold demeanor and lack of empathy would define his behavior in the aftermath of the crime. Algiers' trial centered around his violent history and the murder of Officer Anderson. The prosecution painted a picture of a man whose life had been marked by hatred and violence. His history of criminal behavior, coupled with the cold execution of Anderson, left little room for doubt about his intentions. The defense, however, attempted to argue that Algiers had been under duress and that his actions were driven by a fear of returning to prison. The jury wasn't swayed, and Algiers was convicted of murder and other charges. The family of Officer Anderson delivered moving victim impact statements during the trial, describing the devastating loss of a dedicated public servant. He was a husband, a father, and a friend, they said, their voices trembling. Our lives will never be the same. In the end, Algiers was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Arnold closed the sentencing hearing by calling the crime senseless and ruthless. Algiers' lack of remorse, combined with the brutal nature of the murder, led the court to impose the harshest penalty available. The community, law enforcement, and Anderson's family felt the weight of the sentence. Officer Anderson's family continues to mourn the loss of a man who was taken from them in the prime of his life. The emotional toll on his family is profound, with many still struggling to come to terms with the senselessness of the crime. His colleagues in the Utah Department of Corrections also continue to remember him as a model officer whose life was tragically cut short. As of 2025, Algiers remains incarcerated, serving his life sentence. His violent escape and the murder of Officer Anderson have forever stained his legacy. Despite his attempt to evade justice, Algiers' fate was sealed, and he will remain behind bars for the rest of his life. His appeal for a reduced sentence was denied, and he continues to serve his time at the Utah State Prison. Imagine the pain, the devastation, knowing that a dedicated officer's life was taken in cold blood just because one man wanted to escape the consequences of his actions. If you think this story doesn't affect you, think again. Share this, remember the fallen, and never forget how important it is to stand against violence. Don't let the story fade into the background. Subscribe now to keep up with more cases that demand justice. Case 8, Chad Dorman. Chad, Christopher Dorman's victims were his three young sons, 7-year-old Hunter, 4-year-old Clayton, and 3-year-old Chase. The family lived in Monroe Township, Ohio, a small rural community near Cincinnati. The boys were innocent, vibrant children, full of life and promise. Hunter was described as an energetic child, always full of laughter, while Clayton loved sports and was adored by his teammates. Chase, the youngest, was the baby of the family, innocent and trusting. These children's lives were tragically cut short by the hands of the one person they should have been able to trust the most, his father. The scene of the crime was horrifying. When deputies arrived at the house, they found the three young boys lying in a pool of blood outside their home. The lifeless bodies of the children were found, each with fatal gunshot wounds. There were no signs of forced entry, which meant the killer had been inside the home, someone they trusted. Chad Dorman was found calmly seated on the front steps, holding a rifle, having executed his children in cold blood. The blood stains, the cries of the surviving family members, and the screams from the community painted a chilling picture of an execution-style murder. The absence of any remorse was palpable, with Chad sitting without fleeing, as if the horrific act he had just committed didn't faze him at all. Chad Dorman, 34, was a father of four, a husband, and a primary breadwinner. On the surface, he was just another family man, but beneath that facade was a man filled with rage and volatility. There were whispers in the neighborhood about his temper, but none could have predicted the bloodshed he would bring to his own family. Despite no documented mental illness, his domestic life was far from peaceful. There had been prior reports of domestic violence, including an incident where he allegedly choked his father in 2010. However, those incidents had never resulted in legal consequences. Chad was a man teetering on the edge, with his family caught in the crossfire of his anger. On the fateful day of June 15, 2023, Chad Dorman meticulously executed his children. The children were each shot individually. His 4-year-old son Hunter was the first to fall, with his older brother Clayton attempting to run, but brought back to face his fate. Finally, the youngest, 3-year-old Chase, was ripped from his mother's arms before meeting the same tragic end. His wife, Laura, tried to protect her children, sustaining a gunshot wound to her hand in the process, but was not killed. She survived to tell the harrowing tale. Chad then calmly waited for the authorities, as if the act he had just carried out were part of a twisted plan that could no longer be stopped. His confession of executing them, execution style, left no question about his deliberate actions. Chad's emotional state was an explosive mixture of resentment and bitterness. While his defense team may have argued for a snap moment, the evidence showed something much more deliberate. He had planned the attack for months, carefully calculating how to end the lives of his children. The prosecution described the crime as cold, premeditated, and horrific. Chad had made his children the victims of his unresolved frustrations, trapped in a web of anger and personal failure. His own words in his confession showed no remorse. Instead, he justified his actions, stating that the children deserved it. The crime was quickly discovered thanks to the quick response of neighbors and emergency services. A frantic 911 call alerted authorities to the scene, and the tragedy began to unfold. The surviving mother and 14-year-old daughter had fled the home in terror after witnessing the massacre. The police arrived to find the bodies, and Chad was found sitting in front of the house, unmoved by the chaos he had just created. His arrest was swift, but what followed was a chilling confession. As investigators pieced together the crime scene, they uncovered a grim reality. Chad had been planning the murder for months. Authorities traced his steps back to the days leading up to the incident, revealing his growing rage and instability. Witnesses spoke of Chad's constant temper tantrums, and family members recalled the sudden bursts of anger. The sheriff's detective in charge called the case one of the most brutal and emotionless he had ever encountered. When Chad Dorman was taken into custody, he showed little emotion. During his interrogation, he confessed in great detail, outlining his plans to murder his children and wife. He described how he lined the children up, one by one, and to execute them in cold blood. His lack of remorse was chilling, and his words showed the mind of a man who had given in to a darkness that even his family couldn't foresee. His confession was a stark contrast to his calm demeanor during the arrest. Chad's trial was emotionally charged, with the prosecution highlighting the deliberate and planned nature of his crimes. His defense attempted to argue for his mental state, citing emotional distress. But the jury wasn't moved by his defense. Witnesses from his family testified about his violent tendencies, while the prosecution painted a picture of a cold-blooded killer who systematically murdered his children without provocation. The case was filled with graphic testimony, and the courtroom was flooded with emotion as family members of the victims described their heartbreak. Laura, Chad's wife, gave a heart-wrenching victim impact statement, describing her grief as a mother who lost her children. "They were my babies," she sobbed. "How could he do this to them?" The emotional weight of her words echoed throughout the courtroom, as did the testimony of others in the family who were left to pick up the pieces of their broken lives. Chad Dorman was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence met with mixed emotions. The courtroom, divided between sorrow and relief, saw justice served, but at what cost? The judge condemned Chad's actions as senseless, remorseless, and heart-wrenching. The loss of 3 young lives left a hole in the community that could never be filled. The community was left reeling. The town of Monroe Township was forever changed by the brutal murder of 3 young children, taken too soon by the very man who was supposed to protect them. The loss weighed heavily on their surviving family members, who will forever struggle with the grief of their sudden deaths. Chad Dorman remains incarcerated, having served nearly 2 years of his life sentence. He will never see the light of day again, and his appeal for a reduced sentence has been denied. His name has become synonymous with senseless violence, leaving a permanent scar on the community he once called home. His family, though struggling to comprehend the horror, has begun the slow, painful process of healing, knowing that their children's memories will live on. The emotional toll of a senseless act like this lingers long after the trial ends. Imagine the devastation of knowing your children were executed by the person they trusted most. Take a moment today to reflect on the importance of mental health and domestic violence prevention. You can be the change needed to prevent such tragedies. Like, comment, and subscribe for more real-life stories like this one. And let's keep the conversation going, because sometimes the greatest tragedy is the silence we let happen in our communities. Case 9. Joseph Ferlazzo Holly Willoughby is one of the UK's most beloved television personalities, known for her role as a presenter on This Morning. At 42 years old, she is a mother, wife, and an influential public figure, admired for her charm and down-to-earth nature. As a mother of 3 and a household name, Holly had no reason to believe that a dark and twisted fantasy would threaten her life, orchestrated by an obsessed individual who had been stalking her online. The chilling crime scene unfolded not with an immediate violent attack, but with the disturbing realization that a man, driven by unhealthy obsessions, had been planning Holly's abduction and murder for months. Gavin Plumb, a 37-year-old man with a disturbing criminal history, had been engaging in disturbing fantasies and conversations for years. His plan, however, was almost foiled by law enforcement's timely intervention. His plot was to kidnap, assault, and murder Holly Willoughby, but it was stopped before it could be carried out. Witnesses would later reveal how Plumb had been in constant online communication, fantasizing about his twisted desires, which included not just celebrity obsession, but violent control. The crime scene, though avoided, was rooted in these dangerous thoughts and fantasies that nearly turned into a deadly reality. Gavin Plumb, a 37-year-old man from Harlow, Essex, had a long history of troubling behavior, but his crimes only escalated in recent years. Once convicted for attempting to kidnap 2 women and attacking 2 teenage co-workers, Plumb had shown a consistent pattern of dangerous behavior. Despite his previous run-ins with the law, he had somehow avoided being fully stopped until he went beyond his fantasies. Obsessed with Holly Willoughby, his celebrity crush, he turned an innocent admiration into a horrifying fixation. Plumb was unemployed and socially isolated, spending the majority of his time online, indulging in violent fantasies, and becoming more reclusive. His obsession with Holly intensified, and his conversations with other individuals, including an undercover officer, demonstrated a clear path toward action. Plumb's twisted intentions were laid bare in his chilling online messages. He detailed plans to kidnap and assault Holly, even sharing a so-called kidnap kit filled with restraints, chloroform, and a weapon. The plot was set in motion, but law enforcement caught wind of the danger when an undercover officer posing as a confidant alerted the authorities. They immediately intervened and arrested Plumb before he could act on his terrifying desires. The steps of his plan, from online chats to the gathering of disturbing materials, were all revealed in the investigation, showing how close Plumb had come to executing his deadly fantasy. When arrested, he claimed it was all fantasy, yet the evidence was overwhelming and the intent was clear. Plumb's motive lay in his overwhelming obsession with Holly Willoughby. His actions were driven not by sudden anger, but by years of online fantasy and escape from a reality that he found difficult to bear. His failed relationships, social isolation, and personal turmoil led him to fixate on Holly, turning what started as admiration into something much darker. He admitted that he was unable to control his thoughts about her and believed that kidnapping her would be the only way to bring his fantasy to life. The crime was discovered not through a direct attack, but thanks to the quick thinking of an undercover officer. During his online exchanges, Plumb unknowingly communicated with the law enforcement, which led them to investigate his disturbing conversations. The officers moved swiftly, gathering evidence of Plumb's plans before the situation could spiral out of control. Plumb's arrest came after a series of chilling online exchanges. The authorities discovered disturbing details of his plans, including the materials he had gathered for the kidnapping. They also found a stash of disturbing online conversations, showing Plumb's consistent obsession with Holly Willoughby. His social media profiles, search history, and interactions painted a grim picture of his obsession, and the evidence made it clear that his intentions were to carry out the crime. Gavin Plumb was arrested without resistance. Initially, he denied the seriousness of his intentions, claiming it was all fantasy talk. However, as evidence mounted, Plumb confessed to his disturbing thoughts and actions. His inability to separate fantasy from reality was evident in his interviews, where he claimed that everything he had planned had been a mere fantasy. Still, the evidence was irrefutable, and his arrest was just the beginning of a long legal battle. During his trial, Plumb's defense team attempted to paint him as a mentally disturbed individual, focusing on his troubled past and emotional issues. However, the prosecution argued that Plumb's actions were premeditated and that he had actively sought to act on his fantasies. The trial was a stark reminder of how an obsession can manifest into violence and how easily it can be masked as harmless internet chatter. Holly Willoughby, though not physically harmed, was deeply shaken by the extent of the plot against her. Her family and colleagues expressed their shock and fear about how close this man came to turning his fantasies into a horrifying reality. The emotional toll on her and her loved ones was undeniable, even though she was spared from harm. Plumb was found guilty on all charges, and the judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison, with a minimum of 8 years before being eligible for parole. The judge expressed concern over Plumb's obsession and how close he had come to fulfilling his violent fantasies. The sentencing was met with mixed reactions. Some were relieved that Holly had been spared, while others were angered by Plumb's continued claims that his actions were not meant to harm anyone. While Holly Willoughby has moved forward with her career, the fear of what could have happened lingers. The ordeal serves as a stark reminder of the dangers posed by unchecked obsession and how quickly admiration can spiral into something deadly. The community, too, remains on edge, with many left questioning how often such fantasies could be lurking unnoticed. As of March 2025, Gavin Plumb remains incarcerated at HM Prison Belmarsh. He has served over a year of his 12-year sentence, with his eligibility for parole looming in the near future. His case is still a topic of discussion, with some wondering if he can ever truly change, while others fear that his obsession may not be over. This case is a reminder of how quickly a fantasy can turn into a dangerous reality. If you or someone you know is struggling with the obsessive thoughts, don't wait for things to escalate. Reach out for help. It's not just about one person's safety, it's about protecting everyone around us. If you're as shocked as we are by how close this plot came to becoming a tragedy, let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to The Last Verdict. We bring you more stories like this, helping raise awareness and shedding light on the darker corners of the world. Stay safe, stay vigilant. As the final gavel falls and Joseph Ferlazzo faces the consequence of his horrific actions, we're left with an undeniable truth. No amount of time, no sentence can ever bring Emily Jean Ferlazzo back. Her life was stolen in the most brutal of ways, and though justice has been served, the pain and heartache endured by her family will echo for generations. Emily's story is one of love, betrayal, and a life snuffed out before it truly had the chance to bloom. The betrayal of someone she once loved, someone who should have protected her, has left a void in the lives of her children, her family, and all who knew her. Today, as we reflect on this case, we are reminded of the fragility of life and the power of our choices. No one should ever have to experience what Emily did, and no family should ever bear the weight of such a senseless loss. As we close this case on The Last Verdict, let's hold Emily's memory in our hearts. Let her life, her love, and her story be a testament to the resilience of those who continue to fight for justice, even after it feels too late. If you've been touched by Emily's story, don't let it be in vain. Share her story. Be the voice for the voiceless. Stand up for those who can't, and let's work together to ensure that the love and life lost is never forgotten. Thank you for being here with us and for bringing attention to the truth. Until the next case, stay vigilant, stay kind, and remember, justice is not just an outcome, but a fight worth every moment. Please like, comment, and subscribe, because the fight for justice is one we must carry on together.